Okay, let's get this set up. I feel this is sometime I should have prepared a joke. Ah, that's not my password anymore. That's it. And, play. Okay, so my talk might be called The State of Elm 2017. So, welcome everybody to OsloElmDay. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really looking forward to meeting you all later, and now presentation. So, real quick agenda. The State of Elm 2017. I'm going to introduce myself. We're going to talk about why the State of Elm exists, what it does. We'll go over this year's questions. I'll draw some conclusions, and then if we have time, I will take questions, but there's rather a lot. So if you have a question, you may just need to find me in the hall afterwards. So that's me. I'm Brian Hicks. I do Elm stuff. You can get my email or my Twitter or Elm Slack. You can find me on those places. I run the Elm conference, do the Elm survey. I wrote a book called the JSON Survival Kit that does what it says on the tin if you have trouble with JSON decoders. I've been 2 weeks at No Red Ink, and I have pens. If you want pens, come find me. So, what is this survey for? To answer that question, I kind of need to tell you a little story. So, I got into Elm by watching Richard Feldman talk about Elm. The talk was Make the Backend Team Jealous at Strange Loop 2 years ago now. And so I tried Elm on a client project, and it was great, and everything worked. And like, it didn't break behind their firewall, which was like the really important part, right? And so I came up to Richard on Slack, and I said, hey, Richard, so when's the Elm conference I want to attend? And he goes, well, it's whenever you make it. And I go, well, interesting, right? So I had a whole bunch of questions after hearing that, like how many people, what are their experiences, what problems can this conference solve, where will we have it, when will we have it, how much can we charge tickets, like, I just didn't know, right? So we got together some questions that we thought would answer these, mostly based on the state of closure questions, and we had the State of Elm survey. So that was in 2016. We got 614 responses, so I was like, yes, and then I was like, now I have to scrub 614 responses. So that was slightly less yes, and more like, but it was fine. We got all the data together. I presented it at Luke Westby's Elm group in Chicago, and then wrote a blog post, and it was like, yay! So we found out that most of the people who responded were professional Elm users. There were enough in North America to do a conference, and so I said, well, conference, okay, it worked, yay! So that's a thing. We still have tickets. They went on sale on Thursday. If you want more Elm and you also want to come to St. Louis, Missouri, hey, September. So that worked. ElmConf was great. The survey was done, and time passed. So we're in September, October, November. About December, I start thinking, oh, the State of Elm survey, 2017. Okay, what do I need to do next, right? What can we make better? So I looked at our questions from last year and our responses from last year, and I found some consistent themes and some consistent problems. So the first of all, we had a question about location, and I forgot to put South America on the question, forgetting a whole continent. And the people of South America let me know this. They said Simón Bolívar did not traipse around our entire continent like smashing the Spanish for you to forget us on a survey. And I go, well, yes, that is fair feedback. So we dropped that question. We got the data this year through Google Analytics instead of explicitly asking, because we could get better and more consistent data. It turns out it's not really surprising data, so didn't include it. Problems, job title. This is a literal job title I got. Let me read it. Senior Business Deputy, second Vice, fourth level, Prime Enterprise, Archon, thrice removed. It's amazing. I got this, and I was like, this is junk data, and I'm going to have to throw it out, but like, I'm not even mad. This is great. Like, somebody really had some creativity to do this. But aside from the junk data, I got a lot of, so yes, like ninjas, gurus, rock stars, which is, oh, come on. But I thought I could gauge job title and look and see seniority, so level of influence with the team, area of expertise, yeah? So like front-end, back-end, internal IT, consulting, that kind of thing. And it turns out that, no, you really, really can't do that on a large scale. Because like a junior developer may be really good at Elm because it's easy to learn. But a senior Java developer may be like, I've only used Java for 20 years, and this is quite difficult. It's a big mindset shift. I'm not coming at it with a fresh mind. So it turns out that it's not a good predictor of anything. So again, we dropped the question. And last problem we had was the pains. We came up with a list of, I think it was about 10 pains. So like, can't use Elm on the back end, that kind of thing. And we had them in a select list. And it turns out people would come up to the survey and say, well, I don't really have any problems with Elm, but that one looks fine. And so they would pick it and they would skew the data. And then they'd leave a comment at the bottom and say, I felt like I had to answer every question, but I don't really have any pains with Elm. And I'm like, well, it was not required, but you know, thank you for your honesty. So we had good data on pains, but it was also a little bit skewed because we led the respondents by like giving them a pre-selected list of pains. And we also forgot, like, hey, what do people like about Elm? That might be a good thing to find out. So that turned out to be a question we included this year. So all in all, we ended up with 14 or 15 questions this year. So in which domain are you applying Elm? How long have you been using it? How serious is your use of Elm? This was upgraded from last year. The little caret here means I've upgraded the question in some way that is slightly incompatible, so I can't compare year over year. What is your level of experience with functional programming? Last year it was just this totally made-up banana scale, and it ended with, I eat monads for breakfast, which is like, what was I thinking? I don't know. Anyway, this year it's numerical, because you can compare numbers. What language are you coming from is upgraded from a question about what language you used to write a backend server. Where do you go for Elm news and discussion? Brand new. Do you format your code with Elm format? Also brand new. What do you like the most about your use of Elm? Like we mentioned, is new. And what has been the biggest pain point about your use of Elm? It's a text field now. So we also had 5 more questions that turn out to be not as useful. Okay, so industry, level of influence within your team. Industry turns out to just be not helpful because people are like, I'm in the software industry. And I'm like, yes, but what software are you building? What is your level of influence within your team? Everybody just answered 10. Okay. Did you attend ElmConf US? Do you plan to attend ElmEurope? We're just, okay, cool. It's a number, yay. And then any other comments, and people did one of 3 things, which I have actually included, even though I didn't include the question. They would say, I also really like this about Elm, so I would move that response to the likes. They say, I really don't like this about Elm. I'd move that response to the pains. And they would say, oh my gosh, Elm is my favorite thing ever. I love it so much. I want to marry it. And I've included some of those at the end because they are quite rapturous and very fun to read. So, on to the results. But first, a note about correlations. I'm going to have some slides that look like this background. And basically, I took one question on one axis, one question on the other axis, and plotted the frequency to get the coincidence of the 2 answers, okay? This is a correlation. It does not imply causation, right? Just like always, but be especially cautious when you're looking at these to say, if I do this, I will get this result. No, they are just together. One doesn't cause the other, and in a lot of cases, and I'll try to call these out, you'll see certain things in one set, and you'll say, oh, perhaps, And then you look at another set, and it's like, nope, definitely not. So last year, I told you we had 614 responses. Who took it last year? Anybody? So 10. That's fine. This year, we had 1,170 responses. Super cool. How many people took it this year? So 15. Hooray! You all should take it next year. I'll send it to you. Like, get on my email list. I'll send you a link. It'll be great. Okay, so. Oh, yeah, but yeah, you remember how I said 614 responses? I had to scrub those. It took forever. 1,170. So it took quite a bit of time, which is why it happened in January, and what is it, June now? It took a while. So anyway, domain. These are, I will admit, ugly. This is the domain that people were using Elm in. I've used blue where possible for 2017 and green for 2016. On the correlation slides, it's actually more like a heat map. We'll get there. So last year, people answered web development a lot. This year, they answered it a lot. And remember how the total number of respondents is about double from last year to this year? Well, I take from that, if we about double this number, it's about the same. So proportionally, we get pretty similar amounts of people doing web development, which is like, oh wow, what do you use Elm for? Front-end code? Like, what's that? Like, who knew? We have people using it for games, developer tools, education. A lot of people more using it for graphics last year than this year, even though the responses were in the same place. Hobby use and audio. There's not a whole lot of surprises here because, yeah, what do you use Elm for? Web development, right? Here's the experience using Elm. So this year we broke the top two answers apart into two sections, or sorry, the top answer apart into two sections, being that I'm curious about Elm and I'm just starting to learn about it, and I've just started using it. I'm coding in it. I have like the editor tools installed and the Elm platform installed, that kind of thing. And whereas under a year is I've been using it for a while, but it hasn't been quite a year yet. So you can look at these and see 184, 219, 420-ish, a little under, but you can combine these and see that these three together are far and away the biggest chunk of people are using it either like just learning about it or have been using it less than a year. So there is a huge amount of influx of new people into the Elm community. So like, thank you for being helpful on Slack and for going to meetups, because that really, really helps people enter the community and stay there. And that's what we need right now, so good job. Last year, people had just started, was about half. There we go. Under a year, we have slightly less. These two adjacent bars, so green going into blue, 261 people said they were under a year last year, and 230 people said that they were 1 year this year. They're sticking around. That's good news, right? And we can do the same thing for each of these. So 1 year to 2 year, it's about the same. 2 years to 3 years, it drops off just a little bit, but not really significantly. This is one area where you can't just double the number and be like, oh, proportionally, because the amount of people just goes down 1 year every year. The inevitable march of time goes on. And then 4 years, 5 years, I put that in there because I was like, well, what if Evan answers this survey? So, how serious is your use of Elm? Last year we had a simple scale from I'm just starting with it to it's in production. And then we realized, well, there are different levels of production use. So in production on a side project like Richard's Dream Writer, in production at work internally, I've built some back-end tools in Elm personally, so this has been the case for me. In production at work, user-facing, so something like no red ink or a consultant would ship to a client, that kind of thing, right? There's not actually a lot of variation here. You don't get a curve the way you'd expect, where there's a lot of people just starting and there's a bunch of people finishing, or fewer people finishing and successfully making it to production. It's pretty linear. And in fact, if you look at the amount of people who are in production in any form, they are the biggest group, which is like, well, that's encouraging too, right? People are using it and getting value out of Elm, so excellent. Here's our first correlation slide. I wanted to show you the the curve, well, it's not a curve. It's really a line here. We're going straight down almost, or straight across, between the level towards production and the length of time used. So if you're curious in learning, you're probably just tinkering. That makes good sense, right? And if you're production at work, user-facing, you've probably been using it between less than a year and a year. So that also makes sense. In development towards production is under a year, so I assume this means people that have tried it and convinced their team and gotten buy-in, and now they're working on it, which is also a good sign to me. So people tend to use it more, and the closer you get to production, the longer you're using it. Correlation number 1. What's your experience with functional programming? Everybody said 7. You probably said 7. There's this nice bell curve with a spike at the end and the beginning, except 10. Almost nobody, said 10. I assume that's because they're saying, I'm not like some functional programming wizard, you know, God creating the universe with Lisp or something, but like, I'm also not nothing. So 7, I'm productive. It's a good number, 7. And we'll see this in a little bit. Actually, I'll save that for that correlation, and I'll point that out directly. And then there's this interesting relationship between 0 and 1 as well. Somebody is not very likely to say like, oh, I know what like the little colon thing with the arrows, I know how to read a type signature, that's a 1. They're more likely to just say, nah, I don't know anything at all. It makes sense. So moving on, here are the versions. So last year, 0.16 was out, 0.17 was just to be released right after the survey finished, right? This year, 0.18 is the most recent version as of January. So that's where this data comes from. And you can see that people have successfully gone from 0.16 to 0.18 in a pretty proportional way. So upgrading Elm, despite everybody saying like, oh, this is so hard, it turns out that most people are able to do it successfully. There are a few people who are like stuck on 12 and 13, and I kind of looked at that data, and it turns out that there are people who are just like, oh, I tried this once, and it was quite nice, so I guess I'm still using that version. And that's just fine. You know, I do want to point out here that there is editor tooling, so if you're one of the people, so proportionally more people are on 17, the one back version this year than last year. There are more people who are on the previous version. There is editor tooling, build tooling, that will complete the mechanical transformations needed for you to go from 17 to 18. So if you're one of those people who are like, well, 17 to 18, nah, I don't see why we need to do that. Like, it's really easy. Like Aaron von der Haar has done a wonderful job creating a tool, and there's a link later in this deck that you can just like take a picture of and then go use on your code base. Language background. Hey, did you know JavaScript? Turns out everybody uses JavaScript everybody using Elm is coming from JavaScript. Almost everybody. And almost everybody who answered this had JavaScript in some form, about half the total respondents. I guess I shouldn't say almost everybody then, should I? Half the total respondents. Then we had Ruby and Python kind of neck and neck, Haskell, and then Java. And I thought it was curious that Java came in 5th, of all things. I would have expected something like Elixir or F# to be higher, but no, Java. Java developers apparently like Elm. That's quite nice. Here's a correlation between the languages people use and the languages people use. So Rubyists like Elixir. Oh, okay, Rubyists who like Elm also like Elixir, yeah? Haskell developers and Ruby developers, Haskell developers and Python developers, Python and Ruby, kind of, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Over here, Python developers and Go developers tend to be the same group of people, yeah? It's not a very strong correlation, but it kind of pops out. There's this 10 over here. That's more or less it. And then, of course, we have this thing where exactly the amount of people who use Python. Yeah, okay. Here's a correlation between your perceived strength of functional programming and the language background that you have. So Haskell users almost exclusively answered 7. 7 and 8. Some of them answered up, some of them answered down. But if you look at kind of the gradient on each of these rows, so JavaScript developers, a lot of zeros, and then you get the strongest near 5, 6, and 7, and then it fades off toward 10. Haskell, like 0, 0, 0. Nobody who uses Haskell says they don't know functional programming. But then you get into the upper half of this range, and that's where all the Haskell developers live. Elixir developers are kind of similar, but they tend to be feel they're a little less experienced with functional programming. So this is important to me. I think the languages and the production readiness factors are the most important to consider from a community perspective, because to teach somebody Elm at this point, we wouldn't want to say, make a huge community effort on teaching PHP developers Elm. We would want to choose to teach JavaScript developers Elm, or to teach Python or Ruby developers Elm, especially Ruby users, or sorry, Python users who said they have no experience with functional programming. And so there's a bridge here. We can be able to more effectively teach programmers if we know their background, yes? So when you're thinking about convincing your team, like, go to their background and say, well, it's JavaScript, it's Python, it's Ruby, whatever it is. Here's how you can apply these concepts in your language as a bridge towards using Elm, right? Watering holes. This was a question, where do you read and discuss things about Elm, get your news and discussion? People use the Elm Slack and the Elm subreddit quite a bit. People use the Elm Weekly newsletter. And if we haven't seen an issue of the Elm Weekly newsletter, Philip Poots got very busy, and but he's looking to restart it. So if you're interested in helping with the Elm Weekly newsletter, like, send an email to Poots, because he will. He's looking for contributors to the Elm Weekly newsletter. So if you want to get that happening again, like, it would be really helpful if you just contact him. Twitter discussions, Elm Discuss mailing list are kind of like, okay, sure, that makes sense. This surprised me. Elmtown podcast shows up. More people listen to Elmtown, well, almost the same, than read Elm Dev. And at the point of this survey, Elmtown had, I think, 4 episodes, something along those lines. So, like, it's just sort of, whoop, everybody wants a podcast about Elm. So if you want to write a podcast or record a podcast about Elm, you can do that. Otherwise, just listen to Elmtown. It's quite good. There's especially a series on the history of Elm where Murphy interviews Evan about, like, the design decisions that went into Elm, and it's very informative. Correlation between production readiness and watering holes. So you're more likely to use the subreddit if you're just tinkering, but once you get kind of towards production, you're in the Slack. You tend to be more in the Slack, that is. So, like, this is something where new users, Reddit is very discoverable. Existing users, Slack is very helpful. So one of the things we can do to encourage people to keep using Elm is to tell them, go jump in the Slack. They're very, very helpful. You'll get your problems solved faster. Or if you're an experienced Elm dev and you want to promote Elm, it could be helpful for you to show up on Reddit and say, answer questions. We have a weekly beginner questions thread that I post every week, and we can always use more good voices there. And also, if you're a beginner, we have a weekly questions thread, and you can go ask your questions and not have to feel like you're imposing on somebody's time. It's explicitly a place where we want to be able to get you unstuck, just the same as in the Elm Slack's beginners or general channels. Other than that, there are not a whole lot of surprises in this correlation. Just the fact that this Elm Slack Elm subreddit thing, it's this duality. Elm format. Google elided the options here, which I was annoyed at. I have not previously heard of Elm format. I have heard of Elm format, but have not tried it. I've tried Elm format, but prefer not to use it, and I prefer to use Elm format. And I shared this graph with Richard, and he, like, calculator, and he said 91% of the people who try Elm format like it. I'm just like, ooh, that's really cool, right? So if you haven't heard of Elm format, go try it. 91% chance you'll like it. This is the the length of usage. So if you're curious in learning, you probably, you may not have heard of Elm format. Sorry, I apparently messed up the scale on the left here. I've tried Elm format, but prefer not to use it. You tend to form that opinion between like a little under a year and a year. But mostly, if you're going to continue to use Elm, you tend to prefer Elm format, which kind of makes sense. The longer you use it, the more useful it gets because it keeps your code consistent. And a consistent feedback that people say about Elm format is it just lets you write code, and then you hit save, and your code is nice looking, which is quite nice. It's like having some automated robot butler come in and sweep up after you and clean up your messes, right? And it'll let you know if your code is invalid syntax real quick. So that's how those things stack up. We've got 2 more questions here. Then we've got a whole bunch of correlations between likes and pains. So let's go for likes first, because they're more fun. People like the type system, great error messages, pure functional, the Elm architecture, and the fact that the language is simple. And then we have this kind of almost an exponential decay going towards the bottom. And this is actually cut off at, I think, 25 responses, if I remember correctly. But it goes on for like hundreds of responses of people just saying like, I like this one very specific thing, and they were the only one who said it. So there's an extremely long tail of responses here. This is just cut off. Actually, a couple of these have had that feature, but the big ones are the more important ones that we can talk about, what we have in common, right? So I've included those. Here's how that stacks up with people using it in production. People using it in production like that if it compiles, it works, and there's this real clear gradient here. And they appreciate easy refactoring if it's in production, which makes sense, right? You have code in production, you're like, well, I need this not to break, but I also need the code to be better. Easy refactoring is a good place to be for those. So for the 3 levels that are in production in any form, that's quite strong. Compared to the people who are just tinkering. They're like, refactoring, I really don't care, right? This is just like a toy for me right now. Not a whole lot of surprises here, other than seeing what people in production appreciate more than the people who are not in production. What are the features of Elm that make it nice to use long term? And that is if it compiles, it works, and easy refactoring, which are very tied together, right? Here's how people like things and versus the language background they have. This one is notable not for the things that you see that are strong, but the things you see that are weak. So Python developers just didn't write in that they like the Elm architecture. I discussed this with some people who hypothesized that Python, you have to kind of use framework approaches anyway, so they're like, oh, this is the framework approach in Elm. Okay. But I would expect to see that for Ruby too, and we don't. So I'm not sure about that, but it may be. Haskell developers don't care that it encourages good architecture. They just didn't write that in. They're like, I know how to structure a functional program. Like, who cares? Java devs don't care that it has no runtime exceptions. But other than that, like, oh yes, this one. This was funny. So no, on a different slide. We'll get there. This is pains. This is us getting there. So people have problems with the learning curve and the learning curve of functional programming. In the data, I categorize several types of learning curve problems, so FP, type system, and the Elm architecture. FP was the one that came up the most, functional programming, I apologize. So this learning curve FP is a strict subset of learning curve, so just be aware of that. In fact, we can see that here, but back to the panes. So JSON decoders, second top pane behind learning curve, which again, I've written a book about that, so hey, talk to me. JavaScript interop, so this is ports and kernel code, but mostly ports. Package ecosystem, this is people saying, I don't have a package that I need, so I couldn't find a date picker that works for my specific use case, or I just couldn't find something that I needed in the package ecosystem because it's fairly young. Pardon me. This is very good water, isn't it? People don't like boilerplate. Okay, that's fine. The one that I thought was most interesting was down here, type classes. So everybody says like, oh, Elm doesn't have type classes. Okay, but type classes are both code generation and interfaces. So in this data, people want interfaces. They don't care hardly at all about code generation. Some people wrote, I can't have a macro system and I want that, but almost nobody wants macros. Nobody wants code generation. They all want interfaces. So when I say type classes, listen to me and hear interfaces, okay? But that's how I'm using this term right now, and that's how the people who responded were mostly using that term. Other than that, we've got another very long tail here with people down to saying like really specific things like, I can't use the web audio API. And I also classified that as, where is it, web platform incomplete. It's something right here. This is how the panes stack up against each other. People have problems with JavaScript interop, also have problems with the package ecosystem. JSON decoders are correlated with more or less everything in some way because it's so common. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot of overlap between all of these different answers, and it's mostly because people only wrote one thing instead of writing like a whole long list of things. So the things that have a little bit of correlation are useful signal, right? Instead of being like, oh, that's nothing, right? So JSON decoders and JS interop are intertwined. JS interop and the package ecosystem, JS interop and type classes are common points of pain that happen at the same time. Here's how it stacks up against the likes. So if you liked no runtime exceptions, you don't like that the web platform is incomplete. This is another one I thought was interesting. Components, if it compiles, it works, are not correlated at all. Learning curve, FP, and simplicity are not correlated at all. So if you think the language is simple, you probably already know it, right? This is how it stacks up against the languages. Hey, look, Haskell developers want type classes. That's cool. Other than that, we can see that there are a few hot spots here. Haskell developers want better JS interop, less boilerplate, basically. The one that I thought was hilarious, I've spent like the last 3 years of my life writing Go on the back end. There is no correlation between boilerplate and Go. People who use Go don't think Elm has boilerplate, which is hilarious. I'm glad we don't do if error not equals nil, not to bash Go or anything, but it has rather a lot of boilerplate. And people who come from Go don't say like, oh, this is quite nice, short code. I know I did. And then last, I think last? Yes, this is the last one of the panes. We're just dwelling on the panes for a while because it shows what things we can solve for people to move them forward, right? We have panes versus things, people in production. People in production don't like boilerplate. They need more of the web platform to be there. Actually, a lot of the web platform incomplete panes are like, sound a lot like package ecosystem being too small panes. So there you go. If you go and find somebody saying, I really need a X, and you build them the X, they will tend to be very, very happy. It's, you know, the package ecosystem is young enough still that there are some rather major gaps that people could fill in if you feel like contributing to open source. JS interop in development towards production. Learning curve, if you're just tinkering or you don't feel ready for production yet, the learning curve is your biggest obstacle. So this is another thing where we need to get people in Slack and Reddit in order to move them forward and get them unstuck. Okay, so pains are a bummer. So we're going to finish up with a nice palette cleanser, and then I'm going to conclude with some, well, conclusions. So, love for Elm. After 20 years of programming, Elm is my favorite language. Smiley face. That was nice to see. Elm is the first language I actually get my side projects done. I love it. And the Elm Slack is excessively helpful. I can only recommend. I don't know what it means to be excessively helpful, but I love that they chose to use that word because it is. Oops. No, stop. Yes? Wait, where am I? I just got lost. I don't know what happened. Go, takeaways. I guess I called these takeaways instead of conclusions, and that's fine. If you rated yourself a 2 or lower for FP, get in Slack. Especially if you rated yourself a 2 for FP or lower, get in Slack. But everybody should just get in Slack. It's a good idea in general. But Slack is excessively helpful, and they will probably be able to solve your problem. Noah might mention this in his talk too, he did at ElmEurope, but like, you will get an answer if you ask a question in Elm Slack eventually. And if you don't, like, ping me or somebody else like visible in the community, and like, we'll make sure you get an answer, okay? If you're not listening to ElmTown yet, start. Just go download an episode or two, listen to it. If you don't like it, that's okay. If you do like it, keep listening because it's very helpful, and Murphy's a pretty good host. Upgrading Elm looks difficult, but you can do it. If you're on 16 or 17 and you feel like you can't upgrade, it may be a rather major investment, and I don't want to be like flippant here saying, oh yeah, you can do it, everything's happy, yeah, no, like, it can be hard, I understand that, but like, there are tools, there are people who are willing to help you, you can do it, I believe in you. And there is Elm Upgrade, which is very, very helpful, and if you have a 17 project and you're upgrading to 18, you download Elm Upgrade with npm, right? And then you run Elm Upgrade, and it says, I'm gonna upgrade this now, are you cool? And you say, oh, yes, sure. And then you wait a little bit, and then you like git commit, hey, everything works. It's quite nice. Sometimes there are APIs that get deprecated. Not very often, but it'll take care of all the mechanical changes for you, like removing the primes from your variable names, that kind of thing. If you want an Elm group or event near you, start one. Hey, thank you, Elm Oslo Day organizers. You're very nice. But there were a whole bunch of people who answered in comments and said, you know, I really wish there was an Elm group near me. I know several Elm programmers, but I wish there was an Elm group. And I'm like, you know several Elm programmers near you. Just like go to a bar and talk about Elm for a while. Like, that is sufficient, and it will move everybody forward. And I don't say this to be flippant, but just start what, right? You can do it. I believe in you. And to make that slightly less flippant, here's an offer. If you're doing something in the community and you say, oh, this data would be helpful, or I'm curious what the survey data says about X or Y, or how it affects my project or my approach to what I'm doing, just email me. Like, I'm happy to run queries or send you a filtered subset of the data or send you the whole anonymized subset of the data. Like, I will help you out. So anyway, just email me. There's my email address. There is the link where the question, or these slides will live in perpetuity. And you can get me at Brian Hicks. Thank you very much. So I think we have time, let's say one question and then maybe another one. So just somebody yell at me, I'll repeat it. Cool, okay. Thank you, everybody.